I can see clearly now, the rain is gone. I can see all obstacles in my way.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Tech Writing. This week, we're going to dive into the power of visual rhetoric. We're going to look at a couple tidbits about document design, and then dive in a pretty serious way into questions about how to design infographics and data visualizations that are powerful and useful, which will bring us into the work that you're going to be doing this week in our class. So just wanted to start out with that little song. It's a song I think that talks about the joy of being able to see clearly, right? The joy, the power of being able to access the information that's important to us, and you know, it sets the tone in kind of a lovely way. So I hope that's that song is as pleasing to you as it is to me. It's just absolutely gorgeous. So the way the lecture is going to work today is I'm going to spend some time with Last, and she's doing some stuff with document design at the beginning. And I think document design is a really nice framework for how to understand later what we're doing with, you know, tables, graphs, data visualizations, etc. So we're gonna sort of spend some time with Last in sort of document design. Then we'll move into Bursi-Amba quickly. We won't spend too much time with that piece. And finally, we'll dive pretty seriously into the Kostelnik piece, which is very interesting and is worthy of our consideration. And like usual, I think you'll find that my lectures tend to generally be shaped like this. We start with the basics, right? We start with definitions. We start with to-dos and to-do-nots, right? Or not to-dos. And then we move into more academic, more sophisticated, more nuanced conversations. And again, that's how today's lecture is going to break down. So buckle up and let's talk about document design to get things started off. So Last reminds us that there are a few sort of a few tools in our backpack in terms of document design that we're always going to need, right? And so this is a set of tools that you just want to be aware of and you want to have sort of closely available anytime you sit down to communicate in a technical or professional writing situation. The first thing you're always going to need is you're going to need to know the purpose of the artifact that you're creating. Is this puppy designed to inform people about something important that they need to know? Is it used to get people to do something, to persuade them, right? This is definitely the zone that we've been getting comfortable with, right? The zone of persuasion and rhetoric, right? Is it to instruct somebody on how to do something and give them a set of steps and a procedure? Is it to entertain them? It can do other things as well, but those are the ones that we want you to kind of have access to when you're thinking about what's the purpose of this document. And those purposes can overlap, I think, and I think it's okay if they do. We also want to make sure that when we're designing a technical or professional artifact, that we are privileging efficiency, because especially in industry, we do not want to waste people's time. If you know, the best way to guarantee that an executive will not go with your proposal is if they perceive the document written in a way that does not save them the maximum amount of time. So we are looking for concision. We're looking for concision because time is money. We're looking for efficiency here. And it's funny to say that something as benign as being efficient or concise, like actually would turn an executive off, but it absolutely would. If you can't write a technical document that's concise, then there's no way that an executive for an organization is going to pay attention to the message. And so I think we could say that concision is a necessary but not sufficient condition to all successful technical writing. That is, it has to be there, but you can also write something concise that isn't good technical writing, if that makes sense. So you also need to be aware, and this is something we've already been practicing, right? You must be aware of the rhetorical situation. Who's the audience? Who are we talking to? Who are the people in the world that need to act on this information, right? And what kinds of demographics do they, make up? Are they young? Are they old? Are they educated? Are they uneducated? Are they men? Are they women? Are they, lovers of sport or not lovers of sport? Whatever boxes your audience members need to, do sort of fit into, you need to be aware of what those boxes are. And essentially, she sort of phrases it this way in terms of awareness of the rhetorical situation: who's communicating with whom and for what reason and why, right? But for us, we know in a more sophisticated way that a rhetorical situation involves a sense of audience. We know it involves certainly purpose, right, or exigence. What needs to get done out in the world, right? What are we using this language for? And finally, constraints and affordances. And that's exactly what infographics, data visualizations, document design, tables, figures, that's all these things are actually types of affordances, right? Things that you can use or integrate into your document to make it more effective for the audience that you've chosen. What other kinds of design features do tech writers pay attention to? Well, they look for headings, lists, figures, tables, and finally, a really strategic use of white space. That is, you have to if you're delivering information that's cognitively taxing, it's absolutely crucial to not overwhelm in terms of design. So you've got to leave a lot of negative space or white space to help those ideas sink in. Again, which is very different from what we would do in an essay, which leaves, of course, very little white space. So a couple things to know, some do's and don'ts about headings. And these are important, even though I will admit this is, maybe a little dry. But things to do with headings and not to do with headings are absolutely critical, because your headings are like the traffic cops of your document, right? Like they are showing your audience where they need to go. They're telling them why they need to go there. So what headings can do, right, is essentially provide a kind of organizational overview of the document. And for that reason, it's critical to stay very consistent with your headings. Both in terms of font, in terms of size. Though smaller, like subheadings, can be smaller, which is nice, and we'll talk about that when we get to the hierarchical relationship between ideas. But if you have section headings for different sections, it's critical that they are not only the same size and the same font and bold or not bold, but also that they have the same parallel grammatical structure as well. So in showing the logical development of ideas throughout a piece, you can have hierarchical relationships between headings, and that's where you're going to have like headings and subheadings. And how can you differentiate further between headings and subheadings? Again, you can make the subheadings smaller. You can use boldness or typography or even italics to show, the relative, importance of ideas, or to show how ideas interconnect. The point is, though, in terms of all headings, right, is that we want the reader to be able to scan them selectively and quickly. And we want the headings to increase the readability of the document by showing us what we're dealing with, showing us how they relate in terms of organization, and then providing breaks and lots of white space. Now, the reason headings do this much heavy lifting in a technical document is primarily because they're pulling out the salient sort of contents for readers, and that's doing extremely important work with them. Now, there are some don'ts with headings, and I just pulled this right out of the last book because I think they're super useful. The first one is don't stack headings. So, and this makes sense, right? Because if you have one heading right on top of another heading, it's overuse of headings, right? One heading should always lead to a sentence, and then another heading and another sentence. So as she says, a heading is like a chapter title, and it has to have at least a sentence of information below it. If you have headings like stacked up, like I was talking about before, that could be confusing, because why would you have two section headings that tell you what a section is doing, right? It can be inefficient, which of course is off-putting to any executive reading your document. And at the worst possible case scenario is that it can actually just confuse people. You don't want to overuse headings. Headings are there for key moments of organization and clarification. You also don't want to use a heading to introduce a table, right? You're going to have some text for that. You got to tell us what this table consists of, why you're offering it to us, and what the sort of the working components of the table are. And that has to happen in a sentence, not in a heading. Finally, in terms of a document, you want to avoid what they call widows and orphans. And this is kind of silly, but you actually might have bumped into this when you were creating your resumes, because you're going to have a lot of section headings in a resume. But sometimes the way a resume or a CV lines up is that you might have like, and this happened to me just recently when I was sort of putting my sort of adding to my CV, is I had like my awards title heading, right? But it came at the bottom of the first page. So it was like, education, employment, or whatever, then awards, and nothing below it, which looked really strange, right? And so what I did is I spaced that down and made sure that the awards heading came at the top of the next page and the awards came after. That's what she means by widows and orphans. So you don't want to leave a heading at the bottom of a page that has no body text underneath it. It's just confusing and off-putting. And also avoid any kind of pronouns without antecedents, right? And this is true not just for headings. Like you never want to start with like the word this or it or something like that, because we don't know to which it is referring, right? So we call that a pronoun without an antecedent in grammar. But the effect of that in headings is deeply confusing because we don't know what that pronoun is referencing. Also, just a tidbit to carry into other kinds of writing that you might do outside of technical writing, in the context of an essay, we also never want you to start a paragraph with a pronoun, because we want you to name that noun. And once you've named the noun in the first sentence of a paragraph, then you can go on throughout the rest of that paragraph and use the pronoun. But you don't want to go more than a paragraph without reinvesting in the noun. And then taking us through the pronouns again. That is, I hope that was clear. So we have to avoid pronouns without antecedents. And that's triple important when it comes to headings. Another way into organizing information, of course, is to put information in a list. And a list does something very different from a heading, right? A heading is section, section, section. A list is doing something much more specific in some ways. It's really nice. And Last took this from NASA, and I think it's really useful, really nice. She says, hey, NASA recommends not including more than 8 things in your lists. I love this, right? Because it's just too much. It's mnemonically too much for people. Mnemonic means memory, right? Like people won't be able to remember a list over 8 things long. And so that can be overwhelming. And especially if you're dealing with like steps in an emergency procedure, you never want to go above 8. And so this is just a really nice rule for life in technical and professional writing. You don't want to overwhelm people with the size of your list, whether or not your list is a set of instructions. Whether or not your list is a set of instructions, never push it over 8. She also recommends avoid pushing a list over 2 pages. She says avoid overusing lists, adjust the spacing of lists, capitalize the first letter of every item on the list. And as I said this before about section headings, it's also important for the members of your list is to use parallel phrasing in each moment of your list, in each item of your list. So you want them to be doing the same grammatical work each time, and that just makes the document, again, easier to peruse quickly, makes it easier to get that information out of, in a quick and efficient way. Finally, she says never use a heading to introduce a list, which I think is a fine rule. More than one kind of list exists in the world, and you're likely going to use more than one kind of list if you're doing any kind of meaningful technical or professional writing. And I just wanted to give you a sense of what some of the different types of lists could be and how they tend to look. Probably bullet lists are something that you're absolutely familiar with. Anybody in school uses bullet lists, right? Today it's Thursday. I'm going to get this done and this done for this class and that class. Bullet lists are nice when the information doesn't have to be ordered in any particular way. So you just have to get all that down there, right? It's really great for, as I mentioned, for like a to-do list. Numbered lists, though, are important when you're dealing with information that is that its order is important, right? Like, so this would be like a list of steps, a list of instructions. There are, of course, also lists that can be generated within a sentence. We've seen that before, you know, in a sentence like Dr. Barrett-Fox loves musical instrument, or no, Dr. Barrett-Fox collects musical instruments, colon, banjos, comma, guitars, comma, mandolins, comma, you know, cellos, comma, and the occasional flute or harmonica, whatever. Now, what she does recommend is when you have an a list inside the sentence like that, right? An in sentence list, that you don't want it to be too big. You don't want it to be too big. So try to keep it between 2 and 4 if you're writing it out in terms of prose, just because that makes it, you know, easier to remember, especially since you're enumerating those things in a sentence format. You can also label items on the list if they need explanation, and lists can be nested. So you can have a smaller list inside of a step of a larger list, right? That can get a little confusing. So I would recommend only using nested lists when you absolutely had to, because they are, again, they do leave the potential for some confusion there. So we just want to make sure that everything is as clear as possible. All right. Last also gives us a really nice sense of what she calls other kinds of illustrative graphics. So these are graphics that can be used to illustrate a point, to give shape to information that had previously only been maybe written or verbalized. And these, again, these aren't new to you, but it's important to kind of put them all together and look at how they work in relation to one another. So she gives us 4 different types of illustrative graphic. The first is a table. A table places detailed information in categories that are formatted into rows and columns for comparison. So it's important when you've got exact figures. There are also graphs, right? Bar graphs, column graphs, line graphs. Bar graphs compare and contrast 2 or more subjects at the same point in time, or they can compare change over time. A column graph reveals change in a subject at regular intervals of time, which is really, really nice. And a line graph gets a little more complex. It shows you the degree and direction of change relative to 2 variables. That is, you can compare how things change over time, or frequency or distribution. You can show correlations between things over time. Charts are also, I mean, these are things you're aware of, you've used before. Pie charts, we've seen them a million times. It gives you the number and relative size of the divisions of a subject, and very usefully in some cases, right? It shows you the relation of the parts to the whole, so you get a sense of how parts relate to wholes there. If you're interested, you know, rhetorically, the figure of speech for parts and wholes is called synecdoche, and that's when the part stands for the whole. So like if we're driving down the road, this is neither here nor there, but somewhat fun and usable. When we're driving down the road and I say, hey, take the wheel, what I really mean, of course, right, is take control of the whole automobile, but I just say take the wheel. Or the flag can stand in for a whole country, something like that. That's called, you know, synecdoche, which is a smaller part of a larger figure called metonymy. I'm actually writing a short piece right now for the journal Peitho. Peitho is the Greek goddess of persuasion, about metonymy as an ontological trope. That is a trope that both sort of helps to explain reality, but also shows us reality at the same time. I don't know if I'll finish that before our semester's over, but if it is, I will circulate that for you. There are also organizational charts. She calls these org charts. This is something that I can't emphasize enough. If you're approaching an organization like a community partner or a client, I recommend you generating an org chart for yourself. You're not probably going to give the org chart back to the person or the organization, but you need to know what the divisions and levels of responsibility and hierarchy within this particular organization look like. You also need to know what the communication structure of your particular organization looks like. And so an org chart is really, really useful for that. A flow chart, this is how I take notes all the time, right? This is just a sequence of steps in a process or a procedure. So illustrations, these are also things that you're familiar with: diagrams, photos, animations, clips. We know that a diagram is useful if you want to pay attention to the parts of something complex, right? To the parts of a complex whole. And because this allows you to show their spatial and functional arrangements or relationships. And so this is a really good way to emphasize detail and show dimensions. Of course, we know what a photo can do, right? It shows us what this thing looks like, in reality. An animation can allow us to simulate a process, an operation, or an incident or event. And a film clip can do the same. It can show us or depict a process, operation, or event in realistic detail. So all of those types of illustrative graphics are at your fingertips and can be used in professional and technical writing. So Bursi-Amba's piece is meant basically just to get you into a conversation about whether or not infographics are useful for technical writers. And of course, I think that, to skip to the punchline, I think the answer to that question is yes, they're extremely important. But I put this in here because it's an important historical article. It's an article that comes out in 2016, right? And this is a moment when technical writing scholarship and the discipline of technical communication is changing dramatically and is getting really comfortable, starting to get really comfortable with the sense of the responsibility on the part of technical writers to be able to map things out graphically. Basically, before 2016, and people were using infographics, right? I'm not going to say they weren't, but it's really when the discipline sort of catches up to it and says, oh, wait, this is now the purview of every technical writer. It's not just for graphic designers anymore. So this is one of the reasons I wanted just to spend a couple slides on the Bursi-Amba piece. So why do we use infographics? We use them because they help us achieve our value of concision and efficiency, right? We want things to be concise and efficient. And what infographics can do, right, is help us synthesize or bring together and show the relationship amongst many complex elements in a given situation. So it's really, really hard to do that in print or in text, right? To show that level of synthesis without writing lots and lots and lots of words. But an infographic can show you something super complex, like say the population of a particular place over time throughout a particular period, for instance, right? Like that'd be much, much harder to write out in sentence level. It'd probably be several pages. But in a graphic form, you can show it in one very small space. So it's efficient, it's concise, and it's particularly good at synthesizing, at bringing multiple types of information together to make a larger point. Also, infographics, and this is a little bit simpler, but infographics are useful because we are visual learners, a lot of us, right? Most humans are visual learners. And I like this in the Bursi-Amba piece. They do point to this. There's a really famous South African study about whether or not people actually have an idea of what's on the back of their medicine bottles. And what they found is only about 70% of people understand. This isn't even remember, but it's just understand what's going on the back of their medicine bottles when their bottles are just text. And 95% understand when it's text and images, right? So this is it's a small thing, but it's useful, right? Like images help people understand things better. Now, that's comprehension, right? The other element of comprehension, or the another adjunct of comprehension, is of course your ability to take away what you've comprehended, your ability to remember those things, recall, right? And so Bursi-Amba says as well, humans recall about 80% of what we see and do, and only about 20% of what we read, which is of course a really sad thing in some ways for a writing professor to have to acknowledge, but it's absolutely true. So we recall 80% of what we see and do, 20% of what we read. So infographics have a kind of cognitive edge when it comes to being A, able to be understood, and B, able to be remembered. And so another set of important information there. So another element that Bursi-Amba wants us to remember, and this is one of the reasons I teach this article, because it gives you a historical sense of when infographics start to be sort of par for the course for technical writers, right? Because it wasn't always. Technical writers, until, well into the turn of the 21st century, didn't feel particularly responsible for images or for representing information visually. That was the primary terrain of graphic designers. And Bursi-Amba tell us a couple interesting things vis-a-vis kind of that shift. The first one is, and this is useful and fun, right? Fun to know, is that tech writers in 2016 made almost twice as much money as graphic designers. And they take this a step further and run a really interesting little survey. And in their survey, of the 22 professionals surveyed, 86%, that's about 19 of them, choose to include infographics in their documents because they facilitate the user's understanding. So even as early as 2016, tech writers that are being surveyed are showing the academics doing this survey, oh yeah, we're already starting to incorporate visuals because we know they help people understand information better. An unexpected conclusion, this is something they didn't know they were going to come to, right, is the fact that infographic skills are no longer the exclusive prerogative of graphic designers. In fact, it's probably attendant to the fact that technical writers have higher salaries because we've sort of learned to do that part of the work that used to be just graphic designers' work. So the last article we read for this week is by Charles Kostelnik. It's the visual rhetoric of data displays. And so just like I always do each week, I want to start with some nuts and bolts. I want to start with some definitions, some usable tidbits that you can kind of carry along with you. But I also want to spend time inside academic thought about technical writing and about professional writing. And that's what we're doing with Kostelnik today. So this article gives a pretty simple aim here. And he says, I'll outline several approaches to the visual rhetoric of data design over the past half century, using clarity as a touchstone by which to compare and contrast these approaches. Because data displays are quintessentially utilitarian in nature, the rhetoric of data displays begins with the issue of clarity and the injunction that they must facilitate the reader's comprehension of the data. So we're gonna get a little sense of how to understand these, particularly this approach to conveying information historically, which is really, really useful, I think. Something that guides Kostelnik's work here and guides a lot of data design in technical and professional writing is Tufts' maxim. And I give you a sense of what a maxim is here on the right side of the slide. It's a saying that's widely accepted in its own merits. A maxim or an axiom might be another word for it. It's kind of a claim at truth that's widely accepted. And so this is Tufts' maxim about conveying things in the most effective possible way. And I'll quote here. Tufts' maxim says, graphical excellence consists of complex ideas communicated with clarity, precision, and efficiency, giving the viewer the greatest number of ideas in the shortest amount of time with the least ink in the smallest space. I love this. This is a beautiful, beautiful little construction here. Giving the viewer the greatest number of ideas in the shortest time with the least ink in the smallest space. But this requires telling the truth about the data as well as offering the data in a concise and bite-sized package. So there's more to it. But Tufts' maxim is really useful, right? Get the most amount of information you can out there in as simple way as you can. Now, the problem is that clarity is kind of a deceptive concept. Clarity feels like it would be a simple concept. But anybody who's familiar with rhetoric would tell you, clarity is not a guarantee. And this relates to some of the work that we've already discussed in this class, right? It's particularly when we're talking about the mirror of nature, right? Whether language is a mirror of nature or not, right? And essentially we've come to the idea that language is not a mirror of nature. Language approximates that thing out there that we call reality. But that thing out there that we call reality is still a word, right? It's still a concept that is linguistically constituted. We're never breaking out of language to get to the out there, to get to the beyond language. So clarity seems simple, but isn't. And this is what Koselleck says, when viewed through the reader-oriented lens of rhetoric, and through the multiple lenses of several rhetorical approaches that have evolved over the last 50 years, the concept of clarity, it can almost has to be multifaceted, even contradictory. In short, clarity is anything but clear. Clarity is something, he says, of a conundrum. And so we see this conundrum of clarity at work in the rhetoric of science, right? In the nexus, in the point of intersection between science, the way we perceive things, like the actual machines in our bodies of perception, right? Like our ability to see certain colors, not see other colors on the spectrum, to hear certain frequencies, not hear other frequencies on the spectrum, and aesthetics, right? What we find to be beautiful, what we find to be visually delightful, so it's interesting that science has its fingers in perception and aesthetics. And so what Koselleck argues is that a rhetoric of clarity is rooted in what another scholar, Brasseur, calls the perceptual cognitive-based school of thought. This is a belief in the shared rational thinking of users, and it's kind of using nature and science as its guideposts, right? So its guiding question is a nice one, a really important one, right? And this is on 117 of Koselleck. Which display techniques enable optimal interpretation? So how do we display things in the way that capacitates optimal interpretation, that makes it as meaningful and as efficient as possible? One could argue, Koselleck says, and I'm quoting here, that this rational approach is essentially non-rhetorical because it assumes that readers are universal, but it does offer some rhetorical benefits like the predictability of readers' responses. And it harkens back to, say, the Royal Society of London, which eschewed verbal embellishments that impeded the transmission of fact and truth. But again, the Royal Society of London, operating hundreds of years ago, had a positivist sense of language, a sense that language actually could transmit truth. And of course, that sort of positivist relationship between language and science has been sort of highly complicated in the last 150, 200 years. So to give you a sense of Tufts' axiom sort of at work here, we get a sense of a piece that Tufts did in 1993 called The Visual Display of Qualitative Information. And this is really nice, right? This is where we go back, and this is where we get his axiom from. So he's going to tell us what, and I want to say the reason we are referencing Tufts here is because he's a monumentally important person in the history of graphic visualizations, right? Even before tech writing, he was helping people understand the sort of the cognitive perceptual elements of how we can use data to get done what we need to get done. And so for him, the goal, right, of using data visualizations and infographics is telling the truth, right? Telling the truth about the data. So we're using graphical interventions here because it avoids what he calls the lie factor. It avoids what Tufts calls chart junk, right? So we want it to be structurally transparent. We want it to be we want to avoid clutter. We want it to be visually concise. And this is what we call, and this is just a reference back to what I quoted in the last slide, Tufts' sort of data to ink ratio. That is, you want to get, and we may not be printing these things, but it still works, right? You want to get the most potential data out of the least potential ink. And I really love that ratio because I think it's really useful. That means that you're going to have a lot of data density, right? A lot of data density. What's cool about Tufts, one of the reasons I wanted to bring him in, even though he's somebody to whom Koselleck is alluding, not just because he's such an important person, right, in the history of data visualization, but because for Tufts, and I think this is really useful, these are all ethical issues. These are all ethical considerations. Conveying information using data is an ethical concern. It's an ethical concern because it allows you, if you're being an ethical person, it allows you to communicate a lot efficiently, and it allows you to show what you're showing in a way that is not obfuscated, in a way that is as clear and concise as possible. That is an ethics, right? It's an ethics that values the reader's time. It's an ethics that values the fidelity of the image to the data that you're talking about, right? That fidelity is crucial. So time and fidelity to the information, I think, are the two central ethical concerns that Tufte brings into the mix. And for that reason, I think Tufte is extremely important. He does give us some fun examples of chart mistakes, right? Which we'll talk about in this slide. So there are drawbacks of different kinds of approaches to data visualization. And this isn't to say don't use these. It's just to say keep in mind, if you are, say, making a three-dimensional display, make double sure that it's not hiding data, or that it's not so complicated that it's impeding the reader's ability to make comparisons. We're very used to pie charts, donut charts, mountain charts. And these to me are actually pretty easy to read, but they can require readers to compare oddly shaped areas, and that can be a little too abstract for people. So watch out there. And finally, options for sort of filling bars, plot frames, and other forms can, if you're not careful, result in eye-straining colors and patterns. And I give you an example of what that might look like in the background of this slide. There's just too much going on, right? So our data to ink ratio is really, really off. So there's a reason then for Tufte that what we're doing is not just ethical, right? So it's the most information in the smallest amount of ink. On one hand, yeah, that's ethical, right? Why? Because it respects the reader's time, and it conveys that information as efficiently as possible, right? Ethical on one hand. On the other hand, there's an aesthetic concern, and it's really, really interesting here how ethics and aesthetics line up with each other. So Tufte is influenced by 20th century aesthetic modernism, which advocates minimalist, high contrast displays, and is guided by perceptual principles, so they can appeal really simply to large audiences, right? And that's what you might find in the bar chart at the top of the page. Now, although he derides graphics that foreground the artistic element, Tufte, the social scientist, waxes aesthetic about the wonder and beauty and graphical elegance of well-designed displays. So just because it's simple and just because it's powerful and ethical doesn't mean it has to be ugly. In fact, you can make something, if you're doing your job right, something that is both more ethical and more beautiful, if you pay attention to kind of Tufte's maxim and keep in mind the relationship between your fidelity to truth and your capacity to not waste the reader's time. So there are two rhetorical effects here that you might want to keep in mind when you're creating these data visualizations. The one is make your displays inviting to readers, and you do that by not making it too complex, right? But just by helping the reader enjoy looking at it, whatever that means. There are plenty of design elements that can go into that. And you see a difference between the top chart and the bottom chart. Excuse me. The information is not different, but the chart is a lot more compelling. It's a lot easier to look at the bottom, because if you make it easier to look at, you have bolstered your credibility, because beauty and truth, according to Tufte, are cognate qualities. We're getting really close to Plato here, right? Plato, with the value of truth and beauty. And the definition of the word cognate, if that's not a term, it's a word that's connected either logically or causally by shared attributes. And the reason I wanted to kind of end this slide on that is that I want you to keep in mind, I think it's really, really useful actually to keep in mind this idea that ethical data visualizations have an aesthetic component. Ethical data visualizations have an aesthetic component, and that's what this is one of the reasons that Tufte is so important for us. He gives us a language for how to articulate that which is both indeed ethical, right, in terms of right and wrong, and valuable in terms of beauty or attractiveness or easiness on the eyes. So it's a lovely use of tuft, I think, by Kostelnik there. Now, there are some conflicts between what we might call the rhetoric of science and the rhetoric of adaptation, right? And I just mentioned Plato, and there's a reason for that, because the rhetoric of science, and this is the same rhetoric that says, right, that language is a mirror of reality, right? The rhetoric of science says, hey, it aspires to a kind of Platonic, like universal ideal that supersedes time and place. It believes language can offer us a perfect picture of the world, right? But the rhetoric of adaptation does something very different. It says, hey, different readers actually have different interpretive frameworks, and those different interpretive frameworks profoundly influence what they find to be clear and credible in data displays. Now, this doesn't mean that it's a total subjectivization. We're not making this, we're not subjectivizing this 100%, but it is important to remember, different demographics of audience members may process your data visualization differently. And so you have to keep in mind how different people are different and how they interpret things differently. And of course, it's really important here to think about questions of accessibility and disability as well, because you want your data visualizations to be as accessible as humanly possible, which is part of that ethic of clarity there. So a simple low-key display that readers are highly motivated to explore might engage them quite successfully, but for different readers, that clarity might be irrelevant if the display fails to capture their attention. So it's got to be this kind of really nice balance between super clear and simple, but not so super clear and simple that it's so boring that it doesn't garner attention. Which is a, it's a delicate balance, which is why I have a little image here of people pulling on multiple sides of a rope. Or not multiple sides of a rope, both sides of a rope. I guess a rope only has two sides, sorry. So another element to consider when you're generating your own data visualization is this deeply important concept to rhetoric called kairos. When you're talking about ancient rhetoric, right, you're thinking about kairos as the opportune moment for speech or action, right? The opportune moment for speech or action. And you know this. If you've ever been in a situation where maybe somebody insulted you and you didn't think of the perfect insult till the next day, well, you missed that kairotic moment, right? The kairotic moment is to be able to determine what needs to be said in exactly the moment it needs to be said. I think we've all been in that situation though, where we missed our kairotic moment and the perfect comeback came to us the next day. But for rhetoric, there is no good rhetoric without kairos, right? You need the opportune moment for speech and action. And that's also true in technical writing. And that's also true when we're rendering graphics inside of our technical writing. So in ancient Greek, before kairos even had a rhetorical sort of resonance, it was literally a reference to weaving, ancient Greek weaving. And so the chiron exactly is that moment in space and time where the shuttle passes through the threads of a loom. That's called the chiron, and that's where kairos comes from. And if you watch how like a weaving, apparatus works, right? It's kind of an amazing thing to watch, but it's all extremely time sensitive. This goes through, connects here, as soon as this moves, and it's just kind of a beautiful thing. But it comes, basically the point here is that kairos comes from weaving. So Kostelnik's kairos, and he gives us this on 120, right, is the circumstances of the moment relative to a particular place and time. And so, and this is for him very, very much specifically related to how we represent things visually, right? So he says a map displaying, say, polling data about political candidates might be super compelling to readers in an election year with close races, but it might be not compelling at all to readers in a year that's not an election year, right? So when you see the data itself relates to whether or not that data is effective. So we've got to study what he calls design and context. He says, professional communicators are now expected to visualize data, and because technology offers the opportunity for rhetorical adaptation, readers expect that designers will indeed seize that opportunity. Another element that we need to pay attention to is interactive displays. So interactive displays are important because they increase, I think, the rhetorical capacity of any rhetorical document, any technical document, any professional document, because there's a level of control given back to the reader. And when you give that control back to the reader to choose what facets of the interface they're dealing with, they're more engaged, right? They're more engaged. And so interactive displays give readers access to complex data sets which enhance clarity through close proximity of displays that would otherwise, maybe in print form, be scattered across multiple surfaces. This shifts the user's interpretive act from a passive act to an active participatory role. And in doing so, it becomes much more rhetorically compelling. And I might even go so far to say is that when Aristotle was defining rhetoric for us, in the 5th century BCE, he was obsessed with rhetoric as persuasion, right? Kenneth Burke comes around in the 1940s and 50s and says, well, maybe rhetoric's not so much about persuasion. Maybe it's much more about identification in bringing people into our set of identifications. So it's less a fight, less you're persuading somebody, you're wrestling them over to your opinion, and more kind of a dance, right? You're kind of dancing somebody into your own space to bring them to be able to see something the way you see it. And rhetoric in the 21st century is probably not about persuasion, not about identification, probably most about immersion, right? Probably most about immersion or interactivity. Immersion, I might argue, right? It might be the new persuasion in the 21st century. So the takeaway here is simple. If you can make your infographic interactive, you should. It's not just more efficient, it's actually more engaging for the reader. I'll give you a quick example of small multiples because this is a really, really fun way to see how these kinds of interactive displays can be put to use. And small multiples are extremely useful, and they're very, very hard. You can almost never deal with small multiples in a print situation. It has to be a kind of digital situation. So small multiples is actually a concept that we take from Tufte, which delineates a set of miniature displays within the same kind of plot frame and data variables. But instead of envisioning a handful of small multiples in a print display that's like confined to a single visual field that you might see here, right? This is what small multiples would look like in print. So we've got the same island, right? And then a sense of population growing over time. But instead of envisioning things that way, animations can visualize dozens or even hundreds of small multiples that sort of stream together to create what we perceive as a kind of continuous display, revealing a much richer macro level view of the data. And there you can see this in these bottom columns where you see small multiples in an animated display of population growth in Washington, D.C. between 1792 and 1992. So clarity here is enhanced by the proximity and speed by which users can process these multiple displays in a rapid succession. So here you get I think, a really nice example of the perfect convergence of something that allows for interactivity and actually enhances simplicity through interactivity. So as we move out of this, some things to keep in mind when you're developing your own data visualization, right, is that you have to know the purpose. You have to know the audience, right? You've got to have that sense of the rhetorical situation. But then you also have to target that particular ratio that we get from Tufte, that the ratio that's both ethical and aesthetic, right? You have to generate as much information as possible with as little ink as possible and with the highest level of interactivity as possible. So those are the goals that I'm offering to you this week that will help you to be more effective technical writers, particularly technical writers of who are interested in helping us visualize data in ways that are both efficient and deeply powerful. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. Have a lovely day.